During the panel session, if you have any questions, we'd like if you can direct it to the Q&A feature, and then we'll monitor that way and respond to your questions. Next slide. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We have Dr. Zach London from the University of Michigan, Dr. Mahajan from Rush, Dr. Adia from Miami Cancer, Dr. O'Brien from the Headache Center of Hope, and Dr. Schuyler from Hartford. Dr. London, I'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lucy. There's so many great opportunities to take advantage of while you're here at the meeting. I guess I was going to say we could take the slides down now. Before we get started, I know most of you here are probably to learn about fellowship application process, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time to dive into that. Before we do, I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about the fellowship application timeline. As you know, there's a lot of heterogeneity in neurology fellowships in terms of how they deal with recruitment. Some specialties have matches, right? Like stroke, movement disorders. A lot of them don't. And even among those that have matches and those that don't, there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what their timing is, in terms of when the applications take place, when interviews take place, when positions are offered, and that sort of thing. And our observation has been that among those that don't have a match, I'll just give some examples, epilepsy, neuromuscular, and there's several others, that in the last decade or so, we have been seeing the application timeline just moving earlier and earlier and earlier, almost every year, to the point that there are some specialties like people applying clinical neurophysiology where, they're turning in applications on like the beginning of July of their PGY3 year. And I think part of what has been driving this is, especially again among fellowships that don't have a match, the observation that fellowship directors are often not necessarily recruiting the people they want or not filling their spots, because in a lot of fellowships, there's actually more positions available than there are qualified applicants. And so what they probably have been doing is trying to move their interviews earlier so that they can meet people, offer them positions, get them sort of sign on the dotted line nice and early, and not have that problem. But of course, that results in the interviews being earlier and earlier. And, this is a problem. It's not good for residents. Many of us come from programs where you don't get a lot of exposure to all the things that you want to explore as a PGY2, potentially. Maybe some of them are very inpatient heavy. And if you're asked to make really important fellowship decisions by the beginning of PGY3, or if you're in child neurology at the beginning of PGY4, you might not have the opportunity to explore all of the things that you're interested in, including a lot of the outpatient specialties in particular. And we have survey data from both residents and program directors in the last few years saying, yeah, I think that the timeline is earlier than it ought to be. People want to have more time to explore things, more time to do research, more time to get to know the people writing their letters of recommendation. And so in January of 2019, gosh, it's over 2 years ago now, that's hard to believe, the AAN actually released a position statement recommending a universal application timeline, such that applications would take place no earlier than March 1st of the PGY3 year for adult residents and PGY4 for child neurology or NDD, and that offers be made no sooner than August 1st of PGY4. And again, the whole point here is just to give people more time. But of course, making that position statement and wishing it to be true are very different from that actually happening. And it's been complicated because a lot of subspecialty societies have various reasons to not want to move their timeline to be exactly like that. And there has been some progress in some fields, and in others, maybe not quite as much so far. I just wanted to kind of update you on where we stand with this. Now, there's been a application timeline work group that Dr. Mahajan and Dr. Schuyler, who are on this call, and myself have been on. And in the last year, we were able to get a commitment for movement disorders to stick with their match, which actually sticks with this timeline. Headache, as you're going to hear from Dr. O'Brien, has actually managed to stick very closely to the timeline this year. And then neuromuscular, as is mentioned in the chat window here, has sort of created their own application portal that had no applications released until March, and will eventually have no offers before June rather than August. And it sounds like there are some changes in the pipeline for both epilepsy and clinical neurophysiology, and those are likely, if you are PGY3s or earlier, those are likely to probably be incorporating a match or using a timeline or using a portal similar to what Neuromuscular is using next year. And I think we're going to find potentially some changes in the coming years with some other fields too. So I just wanted to let you know that that is something that has been in the works, in the pipeline. It's something we're thinking about. It's something we're talking about. And we'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are about it. And with that, I actually want to turn it over to our other panelists to introduce themselves. And then we'll start taking questions from the Q&A. Why don't we start with Yasmin?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Adia. I'm the Chief of Neuro-Oncology at Miami Cancer Institute, Baptist Health, South Florida. And obviously my specialty is neuro-oncology, therefore, and look forward to participating in the panel.
Great, thanks. And Hope?
Hi, I'm Hope O'Brien. I am the founder and CEO of Headache Center of Hope. I actually did my residency in adult neurology at the University of Cincinnati. And after that, did a fellowship in headache medicine at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, as well as the University of Cincinnati. So I did a combined pediatric and adult headache program.
Wonderful. Erika?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Erika Schuyler. I'm the Adult Neurology Residency Program Director at University of Connecticut and Hartford Hospital. So my involvement in the fellowship process is as a program director and helping advise all of my residents, which I've been doing for quite some time. I've been program director for 12 years. In their, advising them in how to apply for fellowships, writing letters for them, and kind of guiding them through the process. I also am involved in the fellowship timeline work group with Dr. London and Dr. Mahajan. And, so we've kind of learned a lot and are hoping to move more of this process forward.
Great. And Abhi?
Hi, I am a first-year faculty assistant professor in the Division of Movement Disorders at Rush University Medical Center. I've been to a bunch of different institutions, did my medical school in India, grad school at Hopkins in Baltimore, residency at Henry Ford in Detroit, fellowship in movement disorders at University of Cincinnati, and now I'm in Chicago at Rush. And glad to be here, happy to answer any questions.
That's wonderful. So we're starting to get some questions in through the Q&A. Are all the panelists able to see that? All right. What would be the exact timeline for stroke or vascular neurology fellowship? Abhi, do you want to take that one?
So, yeah, sure. So to my understanding, at least last year, it was the first week of December. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And that's around the time where it's always has been. Now, that is only for vascular neurology. It's an ACGME accredited fellowship, and it's through ERAS with the match through NRMP. If you're looking to apply for an interventional neuroradiology fellowship or NIR or endovascular neurosurgery, what have you, then it gets a little bit more tricky because only a handful of places do a combined match. Most places will have you interview and then interview later on for endovascular.
And the follow-up to that question is, when is it advised to get the application ready? I mean, I think I would just say that for any program that uses ERAS, just like when you're applying for residency, you probably want to have the application ready when it opens, which again, if that's at the beginning of December, that's probably what you should shoot for. So, I think stroke is an example of one that that uses a match and has all the advantages of that, but is still pretty darn early.
And I would just add one thing to that. In addition to getting letters of recommendation from your program director, which of course you have to and you should, if you're planning to get a letter from somebody who's a vascular neurologist at your program, make sure you give them enough time to write that letter, because a good letter takes time. So I would say at least about 4 to 6 weeks before your applications are due.
I will say that for headache medicine, the American Headache Society joined with the American Academy of Neurology in arranging a transparent timeline. And as Dr. London had mentioned, we're a lot better now at trying to help residents with time as far as submitting their applications on time. So the fellowship application process is to begin no earlier than March 1st of the PGY 3-year for adult neurology, and then PGY 4-year for child neurology. And then the job offers are not to be made earlier than August 1st of the PGY adult year, and then the PGY 5th year for child neurology.
So the next question has to do with applying for fellowship as a PGY4. Would it make sense for the fellowship offers to be delayed? Typically, if you're applying as a PGY4, that's kind of like in every field would be considered, you can apply and get a position whenever you want. If you're applying for a position 2 years in advance, like most of the PGY3s are, I think all of the timelines that we're discussing would apply for you. But after that timeline expires, any open spots can be filled by any person in any specialty, anytime, with no repercussions. Erika, do you want to talk about epilepsy and CNP?
Sure, you might know more about it than I do at this point, but basically they're definitely talking about options for having some type of match. I don't believe that there's anything official at this point, and for this current timeline, there was not a match for the current clinical neurophys and epilepsy applicants who are currently PGY3s. So we're kind of hoping to see what those groups will come up with, and hopefully it will be within a reasonable timeline for their applicants.
Yeah, I know they are looking to do it this year. I mean, they've applied through the NRMP and they've gotten very far along to that process. And the things that are still questionable are how, what the timeline will be and how they're going to deal with clinical neurophysiology. Because clinical neurophysiology is a challenge, right? Because some CNP programs are very much like epilepsy programs. They're very EEG heavy, some are very EMG heavy, and some are other things. There are some that are heavy on sleep or autonomic studies or, evoke potentials or all kinds of other things. And it seems like the ones that are very EEG heavy sort of gravitate towards joining with epilepsy and having a match. The ones that are very EMG heavy, perhaps are going to be more likely to sign on with this neuromuscular portal through the AANEM. And then the others that don't really fit into those categories are going to have to just pick. And so I think they're still trying to work that out, and I'm hoping that we're going to have some information in the next couple of months about that. But if everything goes according to plan, at least for epilepsy, it looks like they are looking through going through ERAS, and if they do, their timeline would be similar to strokes, which would again be applications potentially as early as December, although they're negotiating to see if they can postpone those until later in the winter or early spring of PGY 3-year. But then
there's a general question. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, there was a general question here having to do with how to reach out to fellowship programs. But if you were finishing something up, I'll let you finish that.
I think that's all I had to say about epilepsy.
Okay. Well, for fellowship programs, the specific question is it fair to just email, let's say, the program director? And how to best reach out to a particular fellowship program if you're interested. The first and foremost is, even when I was applying, I actually went through the AAN fellowship directory, which is a very useful website and spans all mechanisms of application and specialty. So I think one way to start there is if you go through the American Academy of Neurology, you'll actually find a particular page dedicated to all the fellowship listings by specialty. That would be step one. If you find out that they are furthermore, let's say, a UCNS certified subspecialty in neurology, then I would encourage you to go through there. That way, you know all the steps that are needed, both from the fellowship, et cetera. And you'll also get a listing there of the particular fellowship. Both of those websites often list a website and potentially an email to use for said fellowship. specific to that field and specific to that institution. And I would encourage you to go through those mechanisms first and foremost, and then subsequently reach out, let's say, if you need additional information or you want to get a hold of, let's say, a recent graduate to get more information. And these are the ways that I used then and now are even more readily available than when I applied, because they're available through multiple mechanisms. For example, in neuro-oncology, it is UCNS certified, and they also use the San Francisco match for the actual match process. So you probably want to visit all 3 sites, the individual institution, the AA and directly, the UCNS, and then furthermore, San Francisco match in our case.
There was also a question about whether fellowship programs are paid. And as Dr. Odia had mentioned, if you go on the AAN or the UCNS website, they'll actually give you details about the fellowship program. They will tell you about the paid opportunities. It'll give you information about how long the fellowship is, whether or not they're continuous or non-continuous, the support that they get from, let's say, a primary or secondary institution. So it's a really good resource to go to if you're looking for a fellowship in a particular area of the country and what the offerings are. I will tell you that some programs may not be paid for that year. So you do have to kind of go back and if you're not applying that year and you're applying the next, you want to go ahead and see what updated information is there and whether or not those programs are financially supported.
The top question here is, what's the timeline for neurohospitalist or general outpatient neurology? So a lot of smaller non-accredited fellowships, it's still sort of the Wild West. I don't know about general outpatient neurology fellowships. If I'm not familiar with any of those, if that exists, that to me just sounds like just going into practice. But if it does exist, I'd put it in the same box as hospitalist, which is to say there's a handful of programs that offer it, and it is every program is sort of on their own about when they do the recruitment. They're not organized enough that I think that they're on the same schedule as each other. So unfortunately, that's not a very satisfying answer, but I think you just have to reach out directly to the program directors. Does someone want to take the question about Canadian applicants?
So I can take a stab at it. I do know of a few people who completed their residency in Canada and then wanted to apply to the US for fellowships. To my understanding, yes, you are eligible to apply for fellowships in the US if you've completed your residency in Canada. If you're not a permanent resident of the United States, you would need a visa. Most fellowships, if not all fellowships in the country, would offer a J1 visa for fellowships, unless it's a fellowship that's funded by a T32 grant, in which case you're not eligible. Individual fellowships will also consider H1B, but those are in the minority, and I would encourage you to reach out to the fellowship director and ask these questions directly.
I think I'd like to hear from thanks, Abby. I think I'd like to hear from the other fellowship directors about the next question. And I know we sort of touched on this before, but how do you feel about communication, direct communication from applicants outside of either your match in neuro-oncology or outside of your normal application process in headache?
So I was program director for headache medicine at Cincinnati Children's and University of Cincinnati for 5 years, and I've had applicants reach out to me directly, and I welcome that. Personally, I would love the opportunity to talk with them about the program that we offer, as well as get to know them as well. So I personally don't have an issue with that, and I know some of our other faculty members welcome that as well. How we feel is that, neurology is a specialty that we need more neurologists. And in headache medicine, we also need more headache medicine specialists. So whatever we can do to help encourage individuals to join fellowships, I'm open to that.
It's probably inversely proportional to the number of applicants. So if the specialty is in high demand or that particular fellowship is high demand, they might get a lot of potpourri of emails. So I would just say that it's probably not unanimous. I know in neuro-oncology is a very small field, and we certainly usually have welcomed it. When I was developing the neuro-oncology fellowship program at Columbia University, where I was faculty, I know that we often welcomed any invitation because it was a small program and being, just launched. But I knew other programs that were heavy hitters and established for over 20 years that probably were not as welcoming.
Abhi, it looks like you've said you're going to answer a couple questions live. Take the one you want to take.
I didn't realize that was specific to me. I just clicked on we'll answer live thing, but
Oh.
I'm happy to, happy to answer them. And of course, please correct me if I'm wrong, as always. If one of the questions was about neuroimmunology MS fellowships, again, there is no match for neuroimmunology MS fellowships. To my understanding, specific programs have specific funding mechanisms by which they fund these fellowships. Often this depends on from year to year. Traditionally, a lot of people have ended up staying at their home institution, so they work during their residency to kind of identify a funding mechanism, stay on during fellowship to complete the said fellowship. So it's highly variable, depends on the institution, depends on a consistent funding source, and varies from year to year.
There's actually a couple questions here. One, does it matter if it's ACGME, CGME, or UCNS accredited? So as someone who in neuro-oncology actually saw the transition before and after, when neuro-oncology actually launched the UCNS application was the year I started, 2010. And I can tell you that at the very beginning of the launch, there was minimal impact in the field, and most people who are already practicing neuro-oncologists did not weigh it heavily. However, we discovered very soon, very quickly, that fellows weighed it heavily, that they wanted to be certified. And what ended up happening is that a lot of UCNS certified programs got the first picks of neuro-oncology, and that left a lot of programs that were not UCNS certified not filling their spots. So the fellows actually ended up driving the field and driving the importance of the UCNS certification. I think subsequently in the years that followed, many of us who had not been trained in UCNS program then got grandfathered in by taking the exam, et cetera. And so the field did get pushed towards that direction. That the neuro-oncology field per se perceives it, I think increasingly so, it's weighed heavily. From the fellows, it became very important from the get-go. It did provide uniformity as well. So I think that it's driven from that direction.
I would agree. And in fact, I'm on the UCNS Accreditation Council, and I agree 100%. I think the fellows are demanding it. There is it's a very rigorous process in order to get accreditation from this organization. And it is also protective of the fellow as well, to make sure they're getting a great education through their fellowship.
I'm seeing a few questions about what should be on the application. Does anyone want to comment on how a residency application may differ from a fellowship application, and what sort of things you look for as a fellowship director?
I can comment on that from the perspective of a program director, because this is something that all of my PGY3 residents really want to know and have mentorship about when they're thinking about applying for subspecialties. A lot of them are really anxious if they don't have a ton of papers and and things to put on their CV from their first year of neurology training. And a lot of what I do is kind of reassure them that I don't think fellowship directors are really looking for you to be a PI for a multi-center clinical trial while you're a PGY2 neurology resident. So, I think fellowship directors as neurologists are familiar with the training pathway to become a neurologist and kind of the amount of clinical demands that are required, especially towards the first half of residency. So I think, what's really important is not how many case reports that you've done and kind of line items that you're putting on your CV. I think what's really important is that you have strong clinical performance as a resident. I think your letters from your program director and from your clinical mentors that really know how good of a clinician, how strong of a clinician you are, is probably the most important part of the application. And it's really important that they're seeing, they're going to spend a whole year or potentially 2 years with their fellow in the clinic all the time, and they want to make sure that this is somebody that their patients will really love, and somebody that really connects well, with the clinical staff and that kind of thing. So I think that's really important. And I think in terms of scholarly activity, probably the most important thing is, it's quality as opposed to quantity. So if you have a couple of projects, they don't have to have papers yet, especially if you're early on in training. But if you have a mentor and you're kind of in the process of working on a project, particularly if that project has relevance to something that could be continued or something that would be relevant to what you're doing in fellowship, that would be a project that, even if you're not submitting a whole bunch of posters in the first year, but something that you or your advisor can explain in your statement, or that your advisor can explain in your letter of recommendation, what you're working on with them. I think that those are things that are really going to be valuable in your fellowship application.
I agree 100% with what you said. The two things I would add, it also depends on the type of fellowship. If it's predominantly a clinical, then all you really need is really strong letters from your mentors and your particular rotations to prove that, yes, you're in fact a dedicated worker in your residency. If you are truly interested in a more academic, then you probably want to have some experience in the background. I agree, not a PI of multi-center trial, but something that shows you actually have shown interest and have delved into the world of research to actually say you are interested in that field. Otherwise, it's preliminary interest rather than true interest. But that depends on the degree to which you actually want to go into academics, for example. And so that was the only two things I wanted to add.
The panelists have been chatting in our private chat about this top question, which is, where are the open spots listed, particularly off-cycle spots? And I think the reason it's a challenging question, because there are several answers and none of them are really that great. So I think it depends on the specialty. And I think some specialties will have resources related to their match software. So like movement disorders, it sounds like if through the SF Match, we'll list unfilled spots through the SF Match afterwards. Can you tell me, Hope, on the headache website, does it actually say on whether there are unfilled spots at each program for the next year?
I'll have to look at that. Not that I'm aware of, but I will check with that. I will tell you that for spots that are not filled within headache medicine, there's sort of a quorum of program directors that will send emails of open positions. But I will tell you that the subspecialty has become more and more competitive. And also the funding has been an issue as well. The American Headache Society has put out, though, a fellowship grant for individuals who are looking to go into headache medicine and want to go to a particular area. And if the funding isn't there, the American Headache Society will support that.
I think the UCNS also lists if neuro-oncology, for example, doesn't fill, usually there's less applicants than there are actual spots. So usually I think you could probably go through the UCNS website and find out what fellowship programs haven't filled and go that mechanism if you needed to go through neuro-oncology, for an example.
I would just put this out there as an applicant. If there's a match for the fellowship that you're applying to, and post-match you haven't matched into the places that you ranked, it may be because you're looking for something specific, geographically limited, what have you. Don't hesitate to email the fellowship director. The worst thing that's going to happen is that particular fellowship director is going to tell you that they filled that year. Doesn't hurt.
Yeah, but I really wish there was a better resource that would answer those questions, I think, across disciplines. And unfortunately, I don't think there is.
There was a question from a military who says they'll be applying after the 4 years. And so it'll be some time between their clinical practice in residency and when they actually apply. So I do encourage you to get some letters saved. Obviously, the problem is that they're unanimous. They're supposed to be not private letters, but you can have them draft those letters and keep them for future use if you have a particular person you want to get a reference from.
The other thing I would encourage you to do is if there is a subspecialty that you're interested in going into, to maybe apply to go to one of the conferences and get to meet some of the individuals that are there. I know that the American Headache Society have conferences at least twice a year, and we offer scholarship travel honorariums for residents to attend. And so getting your face out there and getting introduced to having your residency individuals introduce you to other people, that would be a great way to try to get your face out there and find out more about some of these programs.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think many of the subspecialties have something similar, where there are opportunities to either have a scholarship or a special track for residents within a subspecialty meeting, or the possibility of having a discounted registration as a resident. So there are a lot of options to do that, and I think that that's a great idea to be able to network with people in that subspecialty.
Melissa asks, any advice for neurology?
Have any of the...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, Melissa says, is there any advice for neurology PGYTs applying for medicine fellowships like hospice and palliative medicine? And someone else had asked about sleep before. And so those are on a timeline that is, that aligns with the internal medicine fellowship timeline. And so from my perspective, what you should do is just enjoy the heck out of the fact that you're on that timeline, because that's what all neurology should be doing, in my opinion, which is they're not actually even submitting applications until the summer of your penultimate year, and matching around, I can't remember if it's November or December of PGY4. December. So in terms of your application, I don't think you're at a disadvantage for these fields coming from neurology, but obviously the competitiveness of those fields may change. But what that means is you just have more time to explore that, to make sure it's what you want to do, to get letters of recommendation, potentially do research or things like that that may bolster your application. And coming from a longer residency program, which neurology is, that means you're going to actually be more competitive in some ways than people coming through internal medicine who are doing it all at the end of their second year of residency. So I don't have any other advice other than just to say, enjoy that.
To answer Perry Richardson's question regarding UCNS fellowship and whether they had a barrier compared to, let's say, an ACGME. Well, for example, in neuro-oncology, there was no ACGME, there was no alternative accreditation. Initially, some hesitancy when UCNS first launched neuro-oncology, but I think subsequently, especially because institutions failed to fill their slots if they were not UCNS certified, it actually became a welcoming thing if you had the capability and had already had an established fellowship or some sort of mechanism for training trainees in this subspecialty. So I actually think over time, it became a plus and not a barrier. So I think if you can justify that the UCNS certification is actually helpful to fill the slots and to get good candidates, it usually just requires justification.
I would just add too that there are fellowship programs that will only take applicants from ACGME programs. So just check with that as well.
All right, Abhi, it looks like you've clicked, you're going to answer a couple of these live.
Yes, so a couple of questions talk about 1-year versus 2-year fellowships, and I'd like to give my perspective on that. I did a 2-year fellowship. I would say two things. One, if you want to be a clinician at the end of this and you want your career to be predominantly clinically based, talk to the people who graduated from the fellowship that you're going to about how comfortable they feel clinically at the end of a 1-year fellowship. Some programs are clinically very busy. They do a really good job of training clinicians very well. In specialties like movement disorders, it might be actually very difficult because some of these conditions are very rare. And so even if the program is fantastic, you might not see them within 1 year. For people who are looking for protected time from the first job after fellowships, my suggestion would be to go for a 2-year fellowship, because it takes time to go into a new fellowship, collect some pilot data, be a part of projects, etc., and show that you're somebody who's serious about a career as a clinician researcher. Of course, if you're doing a 1-year fellowship in the same department that you're a resident at, then you might be precocious and might have some publications before. And instead of doing a second year of fellowship, you might be able to do somewhat of a hybrid where you start seeing patients as an attending and yet have some protected time to collect that pilot data.
I'm going to add also that for epilepsy, having a 1 or 2 year fellowship does have some basis in sort of what you're planning to do clinically after the fellowship. So for many academic epilepsy programs, if you're looking to do surgical epilepsy training, if you're looking to practice in an academic center, that's a tertiary care center that's doing a lot of long-term ICU monitoring and has surgical cases, you really do need to do a 2-year fellowship. And for many jobs, they are looking for somebody who's done 2 years. And so that's a little bit independent of sort of your research track. That's in terms of what your clinical goals are, for epilepsy fellowship. Similarly, some people actually will do epilepsy fellowships at 2 different institutions. We've hired faculty recently who completed sort of more of a clinical epilepsy fellowship in a program that doesn't have a huge surgical program, and then went to Cleveland Clinic for a second year of primarily surgical epilepsy training in preparation for an academic job where they're going to be mostly doing surgical episy management and stereo EEG and stuff like that to get extra training. So I think, I'm not sure how it would be for other subspecialties, but that's definitely particular to epilepsy.
Agree 100%. And I also endorse the difference between academic and a clinical track. In neuro-oncology, there's very rare one-year specialty fellowships. There are actually 2 versus 3 years in most cases. And usually you need those 3 years if you're going to do something in academics, but it's not necessary. It depends on the well-established program may have research mechanisms already embedded in a 2-year program.
Just to, on the same theme, there's a question about 1-year fellowships being too short, and would it be okay to reach out to your future fellowship director in your final year of residency to start, maybe doing some research work to build up that portfolio? I'd like to, so this is something that happened to me. I was super excited about my fellowship, reached out to my fellowship director, who was even more excited than I was. But then, and I mean, we have a wonderful working relationship to this date, but the conversation that we basically had was that if I want to write a review paper, that's absolutely fine. That can be done remotely. But to truly kickstart an actual research project, you need to be there in the same institution, understand what the strengths and weaknesses of the institutions are, what their goals are, and how it aligns. It takes a couple of months at least to get that going. So yes, theoretically, you can get going, and nobody's ever going to say no to you getting started on literature review or a review paper on a topic that you're interested in, but to start doing research with preliminary data collection or even retrospective chart collection, you probably need to be in that same institution.
So when I did fellowship, I'm sorry. No, I was just going to say when I did fellowship, I actually applied for a 1-year program and got involved in research and was able to secure funds for a second year. So I ended up doing a 2-year fellowship. It's not common in headache medicine, but it can happen.
For neuro-oncology, one of the things, I'm a clinical trialist. That's basically what I do most of my time, is write protocols. And I chose in particular a fellowship that already had tons of clinical trials in their portfolio, because it's unrealistic to design, open, and conduct a clinical trial, no matter how lengthy is your fellowship program. And so the best way to get that experience was simply going somewhere where there was tons of them at different stages. And I got involved at all levels of clinical trials, at its inception, at the design, at the data, but using multiple protocols running simultaneously. And that's how I got most of my experience in clinical trials. I think it might be different for bench research. As already stated, it's clearly much more feasible when you're doing a review, a meta-analysis, something that can be done during lumps of time. But clinical research and even bench research need dedicated time. Clinical trial more longitudinal. Bench research needs more concentrated time. And so depending on your interest, you may want to look at what fellowships have for your particular interest, and whether that's clinical trial, bench research, or just mentorship and doing things like meta-analysis. So you want to do your research beforehand to know what you can realistically get on the other end, because conducting a clinical trial, for example, isn't feasible on your own, no matter how lengthy your fellowship is.
There's there are a couple questions that are in there about being a general neurologist, and I just wanted to touch briefly on those, seeing them in there. One of them is in regards to applying to fellowship after having practiced general neurology for a period of time. I do think that would be desirable, particularly if you've been practicing and develop a special interest in a certain subspecialty. I would imagine that that would be very well received. It's not as common of a pathway, obviously. I have had several of my graduated residents do that. I had a resident who went into general practice for a couple of years, loved headache, and then went back to do a headache fellowship and had no problem matching in a top program for that. The other question was in regards to applying for a general neurology position. I'm sort of speaking for my department, but from what I know, our workforce is in drastic need of general neurologists within both private practice as well as in academic departments. There's a huge need for outpatient general neurologists. So I think that would be desirable no matter what geographic area you're planning on applying to.
Somebody asked the difference between clinical neurophysiology and neuromuscular epilepsy. So you can actually go and look these all up because they are all ACGME accredited fellowships and look at what the differences are. But in a nutshell, clinical neurophysiology is really more focused on the clinical neurophysiology. So it's going to be a very high percentage of things like EEG and EMG. While if you do neuromuscular, it's going to have a higher percentage of neuromuscular clinic. It's going to involve some things like inpatient consults and pathology. And I think the epilepsy fellowship is similar in so much as it has more clinical epilepsy in proportion to the clinical neurophysiology. I think a lot of people who do CNP fellowships are, they feel like their clinical training is pretty good, but they want to bone up on specifically these procedures and interpretation of these studies, and so they're really focused on that.
There was a question of how early to reach out to a fellowship director, let's say PGY2, if you already know what you want to do. I would encourage you, one, to at least have experience in the subspecialty. So you can say, hey, look, I rotated through this, or I knew that, so that you can say that not just from, medical school years that you're basing your decision. And second of all, you can reach out as early as you wish if you really, really know. So I think there's not really a timeline. There was also a question on, is there an age limit or age restrictions on application? I think there's no age limits in most cases. I think there might be an age bias. And so you may want to just, if you have a reason, no matter what the age, as long as you have a strong application, I wouldn't let that sway you.
How do you all feel about child neurology applicants in adult neurology fellowships? There's a question about that.
So I can take that because I was an adult neurologist that applied to a pediatric fellowship. And so the answer is, what ultimately do you want to do? So for me, I wanted to be able to treat patients of all ages. And at the time that I applied to fellowship, my focus was on late adolescents and young adults. And so what I ended up doing was creating a special piece of my fellowship where I was able to get experience from the adult side as well as an adult neurologist. But I don't think that would be too much of an issue, especially if you package it in your application, what your ultimate goals are. But I think it would be great. I think we've also had individuals who have applied to the pediatric program who were adults. So, and I don't know if other fellowships and vice versa, pediatric individuals apply to adult fellowship programs. And I don't know if the rest of you had any comment about that. We welcome it here in Cincinnati.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think there is some crossover in movement disorders as well. It's not very common. And the simple reason is there are not many pediatric movement disorder fellowships to start with. You have to be careful though of where you're going. Most places would not entertain child neurology applicants for the simple reason that 70% of the patients that we see in clinic have Parkinsonism. So it really has no bearing on what you would see at the end of your training. And certainly there are a few institutions that are fantastic pediatric movement disorders centers. Cincinnati Children's, University of Rochester come to mind. But yeah, I know of a couple of people who've trained, especially with Tourette's as their background, with protected time, where you can see patients who are not necessarily pediatric or less than 18 years of age, and that can still be pertinent to your clinical practice, and of course the research that comes with it.
Especially if you go to an area that lacks neurologists, right? And you are the only one able to see both, people of all ages.
It's actually, for being such a rare subspecialty, pediatric neuro-oncology, I've actually seen quite a few pediatric neurologists go through neuro-oncology. So I think they're considered one program, but they can be tailored to you based on the institution. They'll just, instead of doing the adult version, you'll do the pediatric, mentorship, shadowing and experiences. There's a question on the bottom where it says by Divya that academic institutions are looking for general neurologists, but they still expect them to have fellowship. Is that true? And I said, no, that's not necessarily true. It is true that there is a high demand for general neurologists in academic institutions. Often there is a great demand for them, in fact. And I do not know that they are required or has ever been much pressure to do fellowship, at least at Columbia University. When I was there, they were welcome no matter what fellowship they did or did not have.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Both, there are plenty of jobs you can have without a fellowship in private practice. Also in academic institutions as a neurohospitalist or an outpatient general neurologist, you don't need to have a fellowship to be considered for those jobs. I wanted to mention, there was one question that we passed in the Q&A regarding the theme of professionalism. And I think that that's important to mention. Professionalism, both from the side of the applicants as well as from the side of the programs. So obviously neurology is a very small field. We're a small community. Obviously, there's like 15,000 of us that come to this meeting, but it's a relatively small community. And, it's really important to sort of maintain a professional demeanor in terms of both, if there's not a match, but in terms of communication with programs as well as communication of offers. And I think that that's something that has come up before from both sides. So I think just in terms of thinking from a viewpoint, as a program director of a fellowship, of considering the applicants when they're making offers, in terms of giving them some time to consider the offer, and to have to communicate with them what the expected length of time would be before they would need to decide or accept another offer. I think that's that's key in this whole process. And the other thing is that from the applicant side, I think also, if you have taken a position at another program, you really are obligated to inform all the other programs really as soon as you've committed that you've taken that spot. So I think, just from both sides of it, in order for this to work, whatever the system, whether it's a match or, serial offers or, any way that programs are doing it, I think that that's, really, really important to kind of maintain across all parties.
Agree, and I think that answers that top question from Anonymous regarding, how to break the news. You've basically chosen another specialty. I think it is unfortunate that applicants are placed in this position, and in fact, I think that's why Dr. London's initial comment of a universal timeline and a universal system is in the best interest of every applicant. I couldn't agree more. Because having been in that same system right before neuro-oncology went into UCNS, it is an awkward feeling. You do have to have uncomfortable discussions, especially if you're leaving, as I did my residency program at Hopkins, which is obviously a great program for simple family and financial reasons, that it was better for me to accept a program elsewhere that also fit my needs. I think honesty is the key. Being kind in your response and say, I had to choose this based on the timeline and based on, family and personal decisions, and you can leave it at that. Are there going to be some program directors who don't take kind to that? Yes, but I find that these are the exception and not the rule. People realize that there's just pragmatic and realistic day-to-day factors that go into a decision. So I think truthfulness and just as early as letting them know, because they might be holding that spot for you, for example.
Yeah, and to kind of tag along to what I was saying and what you just said, Jasmine, I think having your mentor or your residency director help you in that point, with that process is really important. So that's something that your residency program director is very familiar with doing. So, if you're in a situation that is uncomfortable for you as an applicant, or you feel like you're sort of in a situation where you're not being given enough time, definitely talk to, that's a time for you to call or reach out to your mentor or your program director to have them help you with that. And that's something, that is really important. But also you need to think about, if you're having problems with another program in terms of them not giving you time or them not respecting kind of, your ability to kind of choose what, or giving you an ultimatum or something like that, you need to think about, is that really a program that you want to be training with? Is this somebody a program that is going to really value you as a fellow? So I think that's an important part of it too.
What do the fellowship directors online think about the personal statement? What do you look for in personal statements?
Well, I will tell you, I look for something unique. The mantra of, I went into medicine to help people type of deal is not something that's going to really grab me. So just think about it. If you were having to read, 20, 30 applications, what's going to make your application jump out? And also be honest about why you're pursuing this, ultimately what you'd like to do once you've completed the program. That's some of the things I look for. What about the rest of you?
Well, I think it ties in nicely with the other question. That's the one question that's left in the Q&A, which is, what about switching fellowships? And I think that the personal statement would be an excellent opportunity for you to say why you want to do a second fellowship. I mean, for some people, it's because what they want to do is really the borderlands of those two things, and for other people, it's because they felt like they rushed into the first fellowship before they knew what they really wanted. And I think that's okay. People get that. I mean, we are all asked to make a lot of important decisions in our life. And sometimes you kind of realize halfway through something that it wasn't the right decision for you. And the good thing about a one-year fellowship is you can finish it out and then do something else. It's not like residency where you have to feel like, oh gosh, do I drop out 3 years early and switch to something else? Most people who get in the wrong fellowship just kind of stick it out and then do something else. And I think that's totally fine.
You do want a sense of direction if you have it. Like if you know for a fact you're going to go into academic medicine, they want to know that, and they want to know why you think that. If you know you're going to be a clinical practitioner, then state it and say why you're choosing their program because of that. Where I struggle when I've read applications at all levels is when you tell me you want to do this, but you have no evidence to actually support it, and no reason why. And so I think, just concordance, if you want to be academics and you haven't even done a case review.
Oh, Jasmine, we lost you for a second. I'll finish your sentence. If you haven't even done a case report, then I don't know what happened after that.
Sorry. Just be yourself and be honest.
I would just add, just piggyback on that. And
so you're going to go into academics,
maybe not,
but you haven't even done a case report.
Okay. Just a quick comment. The best piece of advice I got for fellowship applications was that most fellowship directors look, when they're looking for fellows, they're looking for people whom they would not mind being future co-faculty, faculty members with them. So yes, you're going into a training program. There's a reason you're going into a training program, because you're obviously not there yet where you can be faculty, but a sense of direction is always good. Second, don't make sure that your personal statement highlights the personal aspects of your personality as well, because people look at those. Fellows, unlike residents, fellows can be a very close, very strong part of the community of a given division. My division only had 4 faculty, so the 4 fellows that were there, basically there were 4 fellows and 4 faculty at a given time. So it can vary a lot for fellowships compared to residencies.
All right, well, it looks like we are out of time. This is perfect. Everybody, this would be a great opportunity to check out the Eposters platform. So you can just head over, and Lucy gave the instructions on how to do that in the chat. So hopefully we will see some of you there at our individual posters. And if not, feel free to reach out to us, through any of the networking sites at the end if you have other questions. Really appreciate it.